He was humiliated, ignored, and isolated at work simply because he was black. His colleagues laughed behind his back, and one of them openly said he would never succeed in the company. But a month later, they couldn't believe their yes when he became their boss, the very person they had despised for so long. What followed would shock even the most experienced. But let's go back to the beginning. If you want to hear more stories about fighting systemic injustice, subscribe and like. Together, we can change the world. James Carter had always dreamed of a career in technology. He graduated from university with honors, received several job offers, and chose one of the most prestigious companies in the industry. It seemed like everything was falling into place. During the interview, the managers were impressed by his knowledge and skills, and he was offered a position as a junior manager with promising career prospects. It was the start of his long, awaited professional journey. However, on his first day, James faced a reality he couldn't ignore. On his way home, in high spirits, he was stopped by the police. The officers had no grounds other than baseless suspicions. James knew that the color of his skin was the reason for the stop. The officer, while checking his documents, asked personal questions that went beyond the necessary, as if searching for an excuse to arrest him. James remembered how his father always told him, "Know your rights, son. Never let them use their power against you." Calm and knowledgeable of the law, James was able to walk away from the situation without incident. But the experience left a bitter taste. The next day was his first day at the company. James entered the office with enthusiasm, full of hope. But from the start, he felt a cold attitude from his colleagues. The first hours passed in uneasy silence. No one greeted him except for a few formal hellos from some employees. During his first meeting, James suggested a few ideas, but he was interrupted, and his proposals were ignored. Even when his ideas were original and useful, no one supported them. At first, James thought this was just typical corporate dynamics, but soon he realized it ran much deeper. His colleagues not only avoided communicating with him, but also created small barriers. They didn't invite him to lunch, didn't share information about ongoing projects, and answered his questions with short, cold phrases. James tried to integrate into the team by participating in informal conversations, but he was always met with an invisible wall. He couldn't help but notice that other newcomers, who looked different from him, connected with the team much faster. After a few days of trying, James felt deeply isolated. It was as though, despite all his professional accomplishments, people saw him not as a competent colleague, but as an outsider. He recalled how during previous interviews, he was often asked strange questions about his personal life, his family, and even his background, though they had no relevance to the job. Now, these little things formed a broader picture. Hidden yet palpable discrimination. The unpleasant incidents continued. One of the managers, John, openly belittled James' achievements, remarking that people like him rarely succeed in the tech industry. The comment was not only offensive, but also a clear reminder that his place in the company would always be questioned. James felt growing anxiety, but knew that leaving now would mean losing this unequal fight. An inner voice told James that this was just the beginning. He had always known his path would be more challenging than others, but he wasn't about to give up. Inside him, a determination grew to prove that not only did he deserve to be there, but that he was destined for even greater things. Weeks passed in tension and stress. James often wondered why his efforts went unnoticed, why, despite all his hard work, he remained an outsider in the team. Every day was a test. The work he performed with meticulous attention to detail was often criticized or ignored. When James offered ideas in meetings, he was either interrupted or completely bypassed. Colleagues preferred to seek advice from less experienced staff just to avoid interacting with him. His situation worsened under the constant scrutiny of John, the manager who seemed to look for any excuse to point out James's flaws. John always found a way to belittle his contributions, especially making a show of it in front of other employees. Once, during a meeting, when James suggested an improvement to the development process, John smirked and said, "You think you understand this better than we do? Maybe this requires a bit more qualification than what you have." These words hurt, but James stood his ground. He knew that giving up now would mean giving into the bias. He couldn't allow the system to break him. Instead, he began working even harder, staying late at the office after hours, developing new ideas on his own. Each day, he focused more on improving his skills and preparing for future opportunities. He studied new technologies, created personal projects, and drafted proposals for the leadership that could revolutionize work processes. Inside, James wrestled with feelings of isolation and devaluation. He often thought about quitting, but would always recall his father's words. Life is a constant fight for justice. If you don't endure, you won't just lose your battle. You'll lose the battles of those who come after you. These words kept him afloat when everything seemed hopeless. Meanwhile, James started to notice that his colleagues, even those who seemed friendly, conformed to the corporate culture where implicit bias was accepted as the norm. He realized that it wasn't just John, it was the system itself that allowed discrimination to thrive. Colleagues followed these established rules without recognizing how deeply ingrained this bias was. To keep himself from breaking down, James reached out to friends and family for support. They reminded him that his success shouldn't be measured by the opinions of those who were biased. One friend, who worked in media, suggested that James document this story. James started a blog where he detailed his challenges and the invisible barriers Black employees face in corporate structures. His writings initially attracted a small circle of readers, but soon began to gain more attention from a wider audience. The blog became popular among activists oozing systemic discrimination. People commented on James's posts, sharing their own stories, which gave him the strength to continue. James felt that his voice was finally growing louder than the whispers of bias that surrounded him at work. Over time, he increasingly understood that his fight extended beyond a single company. He was battling not just for himself, but for those who, like him, faced invisible barriers. James became a symbol of resilience for others in similar situations. His blog began attracting attention from the media and public organizations dedicated to supporting Black workers in corporate environments. Meanwhile, James continued working on a project that could change his career. It was his chance to showcase his abilities in practice, despite all the barriers and difficulties. Soon, James had the opportunity to prove his worth. He was entrusted with a major project to develop a new technological platform for the company, which promised to be groundbreaking. James poured all his knowledge and effort into the project. He developed solutions that could reduce costs and improve the system's efficiency. Despite the resistance from some colleagues, he continued to work diligently, believing in the value of his work. The project was a success, and the results exceeded the leadership's expectations. Upper management began to notice James, and he was invited to important meetings. However, such rapid advancement did not go unnoticed by his detractors. John and his closest supporters on the team decided that James was advancing too quickly. They began scheming against him, claiming that his achievements were not the result of his hard work, but were based on plagiarism and the use of others' ideas. James was accused of stealing others' work, and this quickly spread throughout the company. John aggressively promoted this narrative among colleagues and management, hoping it would undermine James's reputation and block his further career growth. The rumors intensified, and James found himself under close scrutiny. The leadership began to doubt his success and initiated an internal investigation. However, James was not someone who would surrender without a fight. He used every opportunity to defend his reputation. Over several months, he systematically gathered evidence of his contributions, from initial ideas and drafts to the final solutions implemented in the project. He meticulously documented every step he took to have indisputable proof of his work in case of such accusations. At this point, his blog and efforts to raise awareness of workplace discrimination played a crucial role. Thanks to his media work, James attracted the attention of journalists who became interested in his story and began their own independent investigation. Soon, one journalist James had been corresponding with through his blog published an article about hidden discrimination in large corporations, using James' story as an example. This sparked public interest. James's story went viral. Social media buzzed with discussions about how Black workers face systemic discrimination in tech companies. People began sharing their own stories, and soon the situation escalated beyond the confines of a single office. Public pressure on the company grew, and management could no longer ignore the issue. Public scrutiny forced the company to not only investigate the allegations against James but also to conduct a thorough review of its diversity and inclusion policies. The evidence James presented was irrefutable. All of his work and ideas were well documented, and there was no plagiarism involved. Moreover, it became clear that John and his supporters had no factual basis for their claims. They had simply tried to use their position and bias to block James's career growth. The investigation concluded with the company's leadership publicly acknowledging its mistakes and apologizing to James. John and the colleagues who had tried to discredit him were suspended and eventually fired. But this was only the first step. Public pressure forced the company to implement new anti-discrimination policies and launch programs to support Black employees. Following the scandal, James was promoted and placed in charge of the Diversity and Inclusion Department. He realized this was his chance not only to climb the corporate ladder but to enact real change in corporate culture. He initiated programs to combat bias, mentoring initiatives, and new hiring standards to break down systemic barriers. The atmosphere in the company began to change, and even John, who had once been his antagonist, acknowledged his mistakes and underwent bias training. James accepted his apology and offered him a place in a leadership program, demonstrating an example of forgiveness and transformation. James's story spread through the media, making him a symbol of the fight for equality. His example inspired many, and he continued to use his voice to fight discrimination, not just in his company but in society as a whole. James proved that resilience and determination could not only change a career, but also transform the system itself.